So, hi everyone, and welcome to our latest Biome podcast with Emma and Robi. So, this week we're going to be talking about badgers in the UK. And just a little disclaimer for this one is because we are going to be talking about badger culling and sort of, that whole very controversial, polarised topic. It took us a very long time, I think, to even try and understand the balanced argument. So
and
we
also
want to
understand the literature behind it.
Yeah. There's so much. I feel like we're barely scraping the surface even in this one. But just to let you know that it will be a little bit longer because we feel like we can't do it justice if we have it really short and then you don't fully get both sides of the argument.
A bit like with our palm oil video, we also, with this one, really want to make you think, maybe reconsider your own pre-existing views. My views on badger culling have changed throughout researching this.
Yeah, mine too.
And so, we really want this to be a really kind of healthy and thought-provoking debate kind of podcast. So, yes, and we also want to hear what you think. So do make sure to comment if you have any strong views or kind of weak views on the Badger podcast. It's all good. We'd love to hear it. We want to see what people think about this.
No, absolutely. And just to be clear from the get-go is we're not going at this with a pro-cull, pro-vaccination attitude. It's sort of just trying to present the science and then allow you to make your own decision. Because this has caused issues in the past, I think. We'll touch on this, but with wildlife groups in particular being very aggressive and being like, no, if you're pro-cull, you're wrong, you're bad, you're evil. And if you attack someone in that way, it's not going to be a positive response.
Yes. As zoology students, we're going to come at this from an evidence-based and scientific-based standpoint. We're going to bring in some scientific papers, both recent ones and old ones. And so, we're going to try and not go down an emotive route for this. We're going to look at the facts and the evidence, and we're going to come up with a solution at the end of it, which we think might work. You never know. It might not. We could be wrong. It's happened at least once before. But, so we're going to begin by just giving you a bit of an overview of badgers, their physiology, behaviour, lifestyle, and then we're going to delve into the nitty-gritty of bovine tuberculosis, which is the disease which is kind of at the root of all this. We're going to talk about the cull itself, and then we're going to talk about solutions, potential alternative solutions to the cull, and kind of what people are talking about and what they're saying about this issue now, both the government and people who are against the cull, people who are for the cull, and what scientists are saying. And then we will get ready to read your comments and see what you guys think about this issue. So we begin with an overview of badgers. Emma, take it away.
Yeah, so I think we'll show you a picture on the screen. This is a badger.
Ta-da!
So the Latin name is Meles meles, and they, like you can see on the screen, they have these remarkable kind of stripes, black stripes that are going down their face. And this is partly an indication historically or ancestrally to other carnivores, so things like wolves, to indicate that this is an animal that will bite back. So they've got very, very powerful jaws. And Robi and I have been following badgers since the first lockdown with camera traps. I've got 4 up at the moment at a badger set.
Have you put yours out already?
Yeah. I have.
Are they up?
Well, badger cubs are born in February.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious to see what pre-birth preparations go on in a badger set.
Damn, maybe I should get our badgers, my cameras out. So as Emma said, since the first lockdown, we've been documenting the badgers in our local woodland, and throughout this podcast, we will intersperse camera trap footage, which we've taken of, I say our badgers. I get very protective over my badgers.
I'm quite sentimental towards my badgers.
And as far as I know, I'm the only one recording them, so they're my badgers. So yes, we're going to show you a little bit of footage now. This is badgers. So this is a female and her cubs taken outside my local set in the spring. You can see the cubs are playing with mum there, jumping on her. And that's kind of an interesting point to make about badgers. They're quite elusive. Before, I've never seen one in daylight, and before we set up these cameras, you may have had no idea that you were living alongside badgers. I mean, mine are 10 minutes walk from my house. And this is because they're nocturnal. So this is a night vision camera trap which has been set. And badgers tend to only leave their burrows, which are called setts, these big cavernous underground things at night. And I
think that's a big draw for people, I guess. The fact that they're our largest terrestrial carnivore in the UK, yet most people won't have ever seen them. I have seen one once, maybe during the day, but yeah, it's this draw I think people have to them because they're so elusive.
Yeah, and they're quite charismatic animals, but they're also powerful. So this video you can see now is the big male of my local set, and you can see he's a big animal. He's got rippling muscles. And their kind of lifestyle is called fossorial. They're a fossorial species, which mean they're burrowers. And you can see that they've got these strong, short front and back legs, which are adapted for this lifestyle. And actually, monitoring these badgers over spring has given us some fascinating insights into their behaviour, which I have found really cool.
No, absolutely. All these things that you'd never see, and I think have to be so lucky to see if you weren't using camera traps at night. So they have really, really cool behaviours around their set. So they're very territorial. They'll scent mark frequently and sort of stick within their sort of family groups or the groups that live in the set. So they can have between 6 to 25 individuals living in these sets. So they can be quite big. And going with this territoriality thing, they also communicate with each other through their poo.
I love that.
Which is a cool fact about badgers. And so they use what's called these sort of dung pits or communal latrines, which is very unusual for mammals to do this. But I found a latrine pit 3 days ago when I put up my traps, and I probably shouldn't be that excited about badger poo, but they're these sort of holes. And very obviously that is where they're defecating, and that is also a cue to they'll be able to tell which badger's which, and it's a territoriality thing as well. So I've been fascinated by the latrine pits.
and if you wonder why me and Emma always mention, anal scent glands or marking with scent glands or, pooing to do scent marking, it's because actually for most mammals, smell is the primary communicating sense. Primates are quite unusual among mammals in that we're very visual, but many mammals, especially animals which don't come into contact or have territories to defend, do use these. So the beavers do it with their little patter cake things with their hands. Otters leave spraints, and badgers use these communal dung pits. So
I'll show you a little clip now on the screen. So this is footage I've taken in a set in Bristol, and so this is 2 badgers that are just coming into the dung pit area, and you can see they're not actually using it, but they're sniffing it, kind of gauging which individuals are there. So it's quite a social aspect of sets.
They essentially use their poo the same way we use social media. It tells them who's in the
I
area.
love that.
It tells them if they're sick or ill. It tells them what they've been eating. It tells them if they're sexually receptive. So yeah, it's a bit like Facebook and Tinder all rolled into one, but with poo.
In a poo pit.
Yes, yeah. So obviously badgers are fantastic. We love badgers, but there is an issue, and there is a little bit of a crisis going on here. And it is to do with a disease called Bovine Spongiform Encephalopathy, or as you may know it, Bovine Tuberculosis. Emma, because you love bacteria and weird little things down microscopes, and I hate them, why don't you tell us about bovine tuberculosis? I shouldn't sound so happy when I say that. It's an awful thing. Anyway.
Yeah, you also make me sound really odd, but I am, so it's fine. So bovine TB, I'll go into what it is, but just to give you a scale, this has been a quote kind of by the government and by leading scientists saying that bovine TB remains the greatest animal health threat that England faces today. Wow. So it's maybe they might have changed their mind. COVID is now kind of animal related, but it is a very, very serious threat to the cattle industry in the UK. So what it is it's a zoonotic disease. So it means that it's sort of spread by and between animals. And it's caused by a bacterium called Mycobacterium bovis, which is similar to the bacteria that causes tuberculosis in humans. But this particular one, so the bovis part of the Latin name, indicates that it's a cattle disease, basically.
Right.
But I think why are we talking about cattle? We this whole podcast is about badgers. I think that is so closely linked, because one of the things about this bacterium that has involved the wider wildlife in the UK is because it has many different hosts. It's not just cattle. So one of the other main hosts, other than cows, is badgers. But it can also affect things like pigs, goats, deer, sheep, alpacas, llamas, and even domestic cats.
Oh, wow, so it's got a wide range then.
Wide range, but interestingly, I mean, badgers have become the focus. As soon as people latched onto the fact that there is a proportion of, there's a reservoir of this bacteria in badgers, they became kind of the blame of this problem.
They seem to have been vilified a little unfairly, at least we believe, looking at the evidence.
But I mean, you can see bovine TB is absolutely devastating to farmers. It's economically draining, it's sort of emotionally taxing. So it's estimated that 30,000 cattle are killed every year when they test positive for TB. And it's estimated that this, basically control of this disease, is costing the taxpayer, I mean, estimates vary, probably about around 70 million.
Wow.
Which is...
What you could do
it's
million,
devastating for farmers, absolutely devastating. And we need to highlight that as much as people who are going to listen to this and be like, but what about the badgers? We're not going to solve this until we say, well, what about the farmers?
Yeah.
But just to say, it is a cattle problem. It's a cattle disease. So we'll come to this at the end, but we think that the solution lies with cattle rather than badgers themselves.
Yeah.
And so, sort of just to add on from that stress to the farmers, the way that they currently deal with TB in cattle is they're routinely tested. I think it's every 60 days, possibly, and those that test positive are slaughtered. So that is just a test slaughter strategy.
Right.
And then an alternative solution, we're going to present different solutions that exist, is culling vast amounts of badgers. So there have been 102,000 badgers killed to date in an attempt to try and control this.
And I think part of the reason that there are so many different potential or optional methods of control of this awful disease is because actually we don't fully understand how bovine TB is spread. So we do understand that this is a cattle disease, which is now widespread in the British cattle population, and we also understand that a proportion of Britain's badgers are infected. So in order to understand, and in order for us to non-biasedly and fairly judge all the options for TB control, which we're going to come to in a second, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how bovine TB is spread, or how we think it's spread. So obviously it's rampant in British cattle, but studies do show that the vast majority of cows get it from other cows. Between 75 to 99% of cattle herds that get bovine TB get it from other cattle herds. And that's something very important to bear in mind when we then come to, how do we solve and control this disease? So yes, badgers can contract bovine TB, so can wild animals like roe deer, so can plenty of other domestic animals. And so a lot of early research, when it was thought that badger to cattle transmission was the main thing to target, was into, how do badgers and badger and cattle interact? How do badgers give TB to cattle? Because, badgers live underground and only come out at night, and cows don't do either of those things.
I think that goes back to the elusiveness of them. There was so little understood about their behaviour that there needed to be more research.
Yeah. So it was, a very strong area of research, and it was discovered that actually badgers and cattle do come into contact, but not at the same time and not with each other. They come into contact with a shared environment. So obviously if you've got loads of cows in a pasture, what do cows do all the time? They poo. And everyone's probably seen and probably trodden a cow pat. They litter pastures, which is totally fine. That's what cows do. That's a natural product of their digestive system. But cow pats are quite fertile, and so that brings worms up to the surface. So actually in cattle pasture, you get lots and lots of worms near the surface, and worms are a badger's favourite food. So at night, after the cattle have left the field, the badgers will come into the field and they'll forage around the cow pats, eating the earthworms. And then they'll smear things like urine or their saliva, which is where the bovine TB particles remain as they are infectious, and they'll leave it on the grass or in their footprints as they walk around. And then the next morning when the cows come back into the pasture, when they eat the grass, that is how bovine TB may spread from a badger to a cow.
But I think important to note there that it's a two-way thing.
Yeah.
So cattle can give it to badgers and badgers can give it to cattle. It's not just badgers that are infecting it. It's, like you say, it's the shared environment that was found to be the main issue with transmission here.
Yeah, and a really nice study into this used GPS collars, and it was done by Woodroffe et al. In 2016. And so they used GPS collars and proximity sensing collars to show how the disease was spreading between cattle and badgers. And essentially they confirmed this theory and they built upon it that, okay, yeah, badgers and cows very rarely came into any direct contact, with badgers staying around 50 metres from a cow. But it was this shared environmental contamination that resulted in both species having this disease. And so it's good that we now understand that. And while on the surface this may point the finger at the badger-cow interaction, a deeper analysis shows this actually isn't the case. So Donnelly and Novalet in 2016 estimated that only 5.7% of new cow infections come from wild badgers. And Menzies and Neal in 2000 found that the vast majority of transmission between cows comes by respiratory route, a little bit like COVID-19 at the moment with these particles in the breath. And so this finding has a really key point. With this problem, the thing to be solved is not badger-cow contact. The evidence does not seem to suggest that at all. It's cow-to-cow contact is where the thinking is at the moment. However, this is not the solution we're employing now. Is a badger cull, and this is not the solution to the problem that I just laid out. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the badger cull at the moment and why that actually isn't answering the question that I just laid out?
Yeah, so interestingly, this is something that's dated back sort of to the 1900s, basically, where people wanted to see, once they realised that badgers were a reservoir, they wanted to see whether eliminating large numbers of badgers from sort of high TB areas could then have an effect in reducing TB in cattle. And so basically this led to the whole policy of mass culling, which is what the policy we currently have, even though the government have said they're moving away from that, but we'll touch more on that later. So yeah, I think maybe it's good if we just describe the badger culling process a bit and what that actually means. Because if for someone listening to this for the first time who's just heard of culling, this is probably quite confusing. So basically what culling means is killing, typically by shooting, killing large numbers of badgers within an area. And the aim is to reduce their numbers and thereby reduce the number of badgers which are coming into contact with cattle and infecting them with bovine tuberculosis. So these cull areas can be quite extensive, and it's very hard to actually find out where they are. These are secret locations, and even people with research licenses can't know where they are.
That's interesting.
So it's shrouded in a lot of secrecy, partly because there's been a lot of backlash, which we'll talk about in terms of protesters. But it is that little bit of why shouldn't the researchers who are monitoring these badgers be able to know where they are? But so there are basically two types of culling that happen. So one is sort of localized, what's called reactive culling. So this will be culling in response to a specific TB outbreak. So if there's suddenly a mass TB outbreak, then people can go in and do a cull in that area. But tends to be what we have more of, especially with our the 2020 policy with the new licenses, that's proactive culling. So This is widespread, it's repeated, it's over several years, and it's killing a large number of badgers across a big trial area. So
the current policy is not tailored towards infectious animals, it's tailored towards all badgers.
Yes.
Okay,
so
that's interesting.
Basically it's called non-selective culling is what is happening at the moment. So there's no testing involved. You don't know if you're shooting a badger that has TB or doesn't have TB, which in my mind does raise some red flags. These are iconic, the largest carnivores that we have in the UK, but there's no measure of are we shooting healthy ones or are we shooting infective ones. And interestingly, when they did do some sort of testing to see about how many we were shooting that were positive, in Cumbria, only 3 out of 317 badgers killed in 2019 tested positive for the disease. So
that's just a little, part of it. I'm really trying hard to look at this from an evidence-based, rational perspective. But that is a little bit of an emotional tug there. These are a protected species. And that, that's not the most humane thing I've ever heard of. So now that we've told you about the cull itself, we're going to tell you a little bit about the controversy behind it, or the controversy around it. Because it is quite controversial. I mean, I think out of all of our podcasts that we've done, this is probably the one people are most likely to have heard of. Maybe the curlew episode was a bit niche, as one review put it, and fair enough. But yes, this controversy, what we're going to discuss now, is really at the heart of this podcast. So why don't we start with the prevalence of bovine tuberculosis? Yeah,
so with the controversy with this is, so you would have thought that if you're killing large numbers of badgers and it's effective, that the incidence of TB in cattle would reduce. That's kind of what the scientists are looking for if this culling policy is effective.
And that's the goal of the policy, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, that is ultimately to reduce TB in cattle and help alleviate farmers of this horrible, horrible disease that's affecting them. But what they've actually found is that in many areas, so things like in Gloucestershire and Dorset, the prevalence of bovine TB was higher following a pilot cull than before. So that's just an interesting point to raise. So it's not black and white that you kill badgers, bovine TB goes down. It's not that simple.
Nice pun with the black and white of the badger. Sorry.
I
thought that was quite funny.
Unintentional pun there. So just to give you some figures, I guess, these are from some studies that were conducted. So one in Gloucestershire found the incidence of bovine tuberculosis in culling zones went up by 130% in 2017.
That's a massive increase.
Yeah.
And that
so we're
seems
shooting
to be...
all these badgers and it's not reflecting in a decrease in
in fact, it appears to be exacerbating the situation.
In some cases, but so basically you're starting to get a picture of how complex this is. So there was a trial, a very, very extensive trial, and one point to note is this was actually a trial under the Labour government. So we're also not pointing fingers, we're not politically polarising this topic, saying it's a Tory policy, it's a Labour policy. Originally this was a Labour policy and now it is also a Tory one. So just so that you don't point fingers at governments. So in the 1990s, there was this big trial. It was a 10-year trial that involved killing thousands of badgers and basically seeing is this effective. And basically the scientists who were working on this kind of concluded that it wasn't really having a difference, and that culling could actually make things worse.
And there is a reason for this, isn't there?
Yeah. Do you want to maybe explain? It's something called social perturbation.
Which I think is something we've all felt over this current lockdown. I feel socially perturbated. But yes, it might be. It's not a very straightforward thing to get your head around. It took me quite a while to understand it, because you'd think that, okay, well, less badgers means less infection of cattle. But that's not actually the case. If you cull badgers, there is the potential for more infection of cattle from badgers to cattle. And so this was a kind of a behaviour that was expanded upon by the rather fantastically named Dr. Chris Cheeseman, a government scientist, who came to the conclusion that culling badgers increases their movement by around 5 to 6 times. And so the thinking is, badgers are usually fixed territory animals. They live in one territory and don't move that much. But due to imperfect capturing techniques, that all, and the kind of the social trauma that having some animals killed in a badger group will inflict on the surviving members, and there will likely always be survivors because, you know, they live underground, they're off roaming. Culling actually changes their behaviour. So if they're not culled, they can travel around 50 hectares in a night, often quite a lot less if they've got enough food. But if they are culled, that can increase to over 300 hectares. And this is because this small-scale culling increases stress on the survivors, and also because there's less badgers in their immediate kind of family group. In order to reproduce and in order to ensure their own survival, they spread out. They seek other badgers in order to, you know, reproduce and create a new family unit. So actually, culling, in this instance, can impact badger ranging behaviour, and it can mean that badgers move further, and that means more potential for interacting with cattle. You could think of it in a kind of a COVID analogy. Badgers live in non-mixing bubbles. If you reduce the bubbles, you force the badgers to mix. They come into contact with more individuals, and not only does it spread, not COVID, I was about to say COVID. Not only does it spread bovine tuberculosis between badgers to cattle, it also spreads bovine TB more frequently within the badger population. Yeah. So this is why a lot of the evidence seems to suggest, at the moment at least, that culling may not be a particularly effective issue. It's certainly effective at killing badgers. It may not be effective at stopping badger to cattle bovine TB transmission.
I think there was a really, really cool, sort of interesting quote, again linking this comparison with COVID, by Rosie Woodroffe, who is sort of one of the leading prominent scientists in badger research and culling and that side of things. So if we think about COVID at the moment, so imagine trying to control COVID by getting rid of 70% of people. So that is kind of how what we're trying to do with badgers, killing that large number of the population, but then sending the remaining 30% out on a pub crawl every night.
Sounds like what Dominic Cummings was advocating. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Anyway.
No, but
yeah,
that idea
it's a ridiculous scenario.
That you're going to reduce the number of badgers. Yes, they've shown that's what's happening. But if you've still got TB in the population, and like you just said with the social perturbation, it then causes them to move like humans going on a pub crawl, it's just going to keep spreading. So
and even though population might decrease, the proportion of the population infected with bovine TB may actually increase. And going back to that 10-year study you mentioned earlier, their results were interesting, very interesting. So they found that in the core area of the cull zone, badger to cattle transmission did decrease by around 25%. But the badgers that survived moved out to the edge of the cull zone, and on the edge of the cull zone, there was an increase in bovine TB by 25%. So
Yeah.
the positive and negative effects completely cancelled each other out. And in a follow-up study in a few years' time, those badgers on the outside of the cull zone then filtered back in. The cows interacted with each other, and the problem started all over again. So, yeah, we've laid out for you, and again, you really have to form your own opinion on this. But we've laid out for you a couple of potential shortfalls with the program of badger culling as it is at the moment. But now we're going to tell you about some potential alternative solutions, which may, solve the problem. And what's quite nice about these solutions is whereas badger culling sees the problem as badger to cattle transmission, which the evidence doesn't say it is, these new solutions actually focus on either just the cattle or just the badgers. And so I think, why don't you tell us about the first one?
Yeah, so the first one is an interesting one. This is something that, upon reading it, I thought might work.
Me as well,
but then realised that it's actually just as bad as large-scale culling. So this is something that was proposed, but just keep in mind as I'm telling you this that it doesn't work and it's not effective. So it's what's called TVR. So this approach of test, vaccinate and remove. And so this is the current strategy that they mainly have in Wales at the moment. And what this means is, like we said before, it's basically non-selective, the culling. You don't know if they're positive or negative for TB. So what this one does so test, vaccinate, remove, like it says, you test the badgers first for infection. So that will be, often you have baited cages and things like that, and then you can test them and vaccinate them and monitor them while they're in the cage. And so you'll test the badgers, and those that are negative will be vaccinated with a TB vaccination, and then those that are positive will be killed. So the idea is that you're removing those that test positive and therefore removing the reservoir of TB from badgers.
And so on the surface, that sounds quite... I don't like to see any wild animal killed, but on the surface, I could probably stomach it.
Yeah. Because overall, it will remove smaller numbers of badgers if you're being selective. But what they've found is that even this small-scale culling, so even killing a few individuals within the set, can still cause social perturbation and disrupt them enough that they are then going to expand further, and therefore they move out of the home range. And this can actually exacerbate the problem even more, because you're not killing vast numbers, but they're still moving, they're still spreading from low risk zones into high risk zones, then moving back. So even killing a small number of individuals within the group has shown that they're going to move and they're going to spread. So from this scientific evidence, I kind of think that this shows that killing badgers full stop is not the way that we should go with this, because it causes them to move.
Right. So what about vaccinating badgers?
This is another solution. Yeah. So this has seen quite a lot of success, and this is actually the policy that the government says they're moving towards, because they think it could work. So basically with vaccinating, like we've seen with COVID, the only way we're going to get rid of this disease is through vaccinating and having a healthy population. Exactly, that's what I think we should do with badgers. Because if, like we've said, this is a cattle problem, but obviously badgers play a role, so conservationists can intervene there. So if badgers aren't a reservoir, then they won't be able to spread it amongst themselves, and they won't be able to spread it to cattle either. So I think kind of a model system is being carried out by the Cornwall Wildlife Trust at the moment. I have very, very few flaws in the way that they are managing this. It seems to work really well, in my non-expert opinion. So basically they sort of looked at this from a human social science attitude. So whereas a lot of other wildlife groups have this very openly anti-culling attitude, they've decided to remove all of that from their logos and their advertising about their project, and they have renamed it so that they're pro-vaccination instead. So this automatically flips it on its head so that it's presenting the positive first and this way they're able to work with farmers, and they're not attacking farmers who are pro-culling.
So they've they've changed the shift of they've reframed the question. It's not what are they against, it's what are they for.
Yes.
Interesting.
What are they for? And also, farmers are at the heart of what they do. So what they found is that they're giving farmers a choice. Farmers didn't realise they could have a choice before, because for decades it's been culling, it's been badgers that are the problem. That's what they've been told. Whereas the Cornwall Wildlife Trust are going in, they're not telling them not to keep culling, they're not trying to force them, but they're saying, look, this is the science behind the vaccination, this is why we think it would work, would you like to consider vaccination instead of culling?
And there's been some positive results, as I understand it. There is some hard numbers to back up the proposition that what they're doing is working. Yes,
no, absolutely. So they found that vaccinating badgers reduces the rate of new infections by 76%. So
that's
a significant number.
Yeah.
So like we said with linking this back to COVID again, the Oxford vaccine is about 60-70% effective. That's kind of all you need. It's the idea of herd immunity, that once a certain number are vaccinated, it doesn't need to be 100% effective, because it then they found that if you vaccinate a third of the adults in a social group, this will reduce infections in unvaccinated badger cubs by 79%.
That's really high.
Yeah. So It's not just the adults, this is filtering down to the cubs.
Oh, cool.
And the idea with this is it's so much more humane than culling. Just, you can look this up. I'm not going to try and... No, I will scar you a bit, but I think people need to know. But with culling, there have been arguments that some badgers haven't died until 5 minutes afterwards. That is a long... Shot. Yes, after they've been shot.
Yeah, that's a long time.
So... There's ethical concerns there,
and so does social perturbation happen when badgers have been vaccinated then? Because that social perturbation is what tripped up TVR. Is that still an issue with this solution?
No, it isn't.
Oh, that's good.
So yeah. So this is one very, very positive thing, because they're doing it in a very humane way. The traps are baited beforehand with peanuts and things that the badgers they come to associate the cage with nothing hugely scary.
Right.
And then it'll be one vaccination, they only need one, but this has to happen for every year for 5 years.
Okay, so there is a long-term commitment with this.
Yeah, it is a long-term commitment, but the idea is that as opposed to TVR, where you kill the infected badgers, here you just assume that over time the badgers that are infected will die off. There's no killing. It's just that over time the disease will reduce in the population, and so there isn't perturbation.
Okay.
And so they're protected with vaccines, helping the cattle, and then they also don't spread.
So that sounds like it could really have a lot of potential.
Yeah, no, it does, and I think there is. We've mentioned this throughout. This is a cattle problem.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about there's some solutions in cattle that I think we should be considering?
So I actually don't entirely see the point. This really is me expressing an opinion. Based on everything I've read about this, I don't even think vaccination of badgers is necessary. My personal opinion, could be wrong, I'm sure I am. But this is a cattle problem, and we know from the statistics that it's not badger to cattle transmission that's the problem, it's cattle to cattle transmission. So I am slightly confused about why we're even talking about why badgers are even part of this conversation in the first place. This is a cattle problem, cattle are the solution. So vaccinate the cattle. Vaccinate all the cattle. Every cow in the UK needs to be vaccinated from birth, and if it's already alive, jab it now. So, culling badgers to stop TB in cattle is a little bit like culling bats to stop COVID-19 in humans. Almost entirely pointless now, when it's far too late, because now, when humans aren't getting COVID from bats, we're getting it from each other. And, we're not going around vaccinating all the bats in Wuhan. yes, I do know that bats are not the sole culprit of COVID, and there's a lot of issue there. I'm just putting an anecdote out there.
Yeah.
So I actually view the vaccination of badgers, and again, this is entirely my personal view, as somewhat pointless. You could have every single badger in the UK could have bovine TB, to my mind, and it wouldn't matter as long as every single cow in the UK had the vaccine, because then even that 5% of badger to cattle transmission, it wouldn't happen. The cows physically cannot get infected. So
I mean, what they've said as well just is, if you killed every single badger in the UK, every single one, there would still be TB, because in fact, it's circulating in cattle.
Exactly, and all the TB would be in the cattle now. So, the solution I personally favour is vaccinating cattle. There is a vaccine available, the BCG vaccine, the same one used in badgers and humans, but there is a shortfall, and this time the shortfall is political. And the European Commission has ruled out the cattle vaccine for the foreseeable future. And the reason for this is, as a member of the European Union, you cannot sell beef or cattle that has bovine TB in it. Which is fair enough. You don't want to sell it. You don't want people to get ill. Fair enough. I don't have an issue with that. The trouble is, it's difficult to tell between meat that has had bovine TB and meat that has had a vaccine. So at the moment, the general thing is, no, we can't have any cattle vaccination because we can't tell if that's TB or vaccine.
And I think just to explain that is that, I mean, probably people know how vaccines work, but the BCG vaccine is a live vaccine. So it involves putting some of sort of the TB molecules into the cattle, so then they develop and build up a resistance to it. Yeah. So it comes up the same on a test if you test positive for TB because you have it or because you've had the vaccine. So that's why there's an issue there.
Yeah. However, now we have an opportunity. Regardless of what you think about Brexit and the European Union, we now have an opportunity in that we've left the EU, so we are no longer subject to that same European Commission regulation. And recently there's been a breakthrough on a reliable test that can tell the difference between vaccinated cattle and TB-infected cattle. And it's got the fantastic name of the DIVA test, which I think is wonderful. So, to my mind, the most sensible solution, perhaps it's not the most economical, perhaps it's not the most the most time effective, but my preferred strategy is forget about the badgers. The badgers are kind of irrelevant to this problem, to my mind. It's the cattle. Vaccinate every single live birth of a cow. If a cow's born in a field, jab it. Cows living in a field now, jab it. And then you will achieve true, literal herd immunity. Every single cow will have a BT? Bovine tuberculosis vaccine, and so it doesn't matter if every single badger in the UK has bovine tuberculosis, or if they're all, as Emma said, they could all be dead, but the problem would have gone away. And there is.
I think one interesting thing to note though is, so there was a discussion between sort of key badger scientists happening, and they said we said 75 to 99% is between cattle to cattle, and so they said while that number isn't 100. Conservationists and people who care about badgers and don't want to see them killed have a role to play with that. But I fully agree with you. I think vaccinating the cattle and having an accurate test is the best way forwards.
The other addition to that is that we need to reduce, or at the very least, test cattle before they're moved. So we have a very large agricultural tradition in this country, and that means cattle move around from end to end of the country all the time. There are around 4.5 million cattle movements in the UK last year alone. And that doesn't come with a test. You can legally move untested cattle from a high TB area to a low TB area without testing. That is a key issue which needs to be addressed. So I think there needs to be, you can't move your cattle unless you get tested. And the government does have a role to play in ensuring that cattle tests and cattle vaccines are rolled out across the country. Wow, what a time to be talking about this as they're also doing the COVID vaccine. It's almost as if we planned that.
But I think that shows the importance that a vaccine can have, not just for people, but also for cattle. Like this, a vaccine is the only way to eradicate bovine TB. Culling, yes, arguably has a role in localised areas, but it's not going to go away. It's just going to be a cycle if we don't vaccinate cattle.
Yeah. I have to admit, just to express another opinion, I think if you had cattle vaccination to the fullest extent, you wouldn't even need localized culling. At the moment, because we're not fully engaged with this process, I think there probably is room for a little localized culling in crisis areas. So yeah, those are all the kind of the controversial issues behind the cull, and we've made you think with some of the solutions. Me and Emma don't entirely agree on which solution to go with, and there's at least 3 big ones. So we'd love to hear what you think their solution is. But now we're just going to go into a little bit of the kind of the national opposition to the cull and some of the recent governmental developments which have happened really, really recently. Do you want to start with opposition to the cull?
Yeah, so as you can, maybe this has sparked sort of controversy even in yourself, not knowing. I mean, Robi and I, like we've just said, we don't fully agree what the solution is because it's so complex. The science is complex. But one of the most, I would say, I don't know what the right word is, forceful oppositions
vociferous.
Yes.
Sorry, it just popped into my head.
Vociferous oppositions to the cull was a group called Stop the Cull Campaign. And basically, I think their intentions were good. Their aim was to basically disrupt the cull and stop it. But because, like we said, these cull sites are secret, they don't know where they are, the way that they did this was ringing people who they thought were part of the cull and pretending to be someone they weren't on the phone to then get answers out of them as to who was involved in the cull, when was it going to happen, where was it going to be, how big was it going to be.
Oh my God.
And so already, I mean, there are some confidentiality issues there. You're pretending you're someone you're not on the phone. And then they took this a step further. So they then published the names and addresses of people who organised the cull. So personal names, personal addresses, personal telephone numbers. And they put this on a website and were basically, these people were listed as badger killers.
Oh my God.
And they received, as much as I don't agree with the cull, I think this is the wrong way 100% to go about this.
This is completely out of order.
I mean, the people these names that went up, they received death threats, they received funeral plans, like someone had put in a plan for someone's funeral. Like it got very serious and
Jesus.
They felt very unsafe.
That's not an ethical... Okay, that is bang out of order. That is complete... I mean, there sounds like there might have a fair few laws maybe even broken there. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but that's just outrageous. You can't do no matter how strongly you feel about this.
Yeah.
You're never going to solve anything by behaving like this towards people. You have to be kind. You have to be considerate. You have to listen to both sides of the debate, and you have to follow the evidence. And
exactly,
that is just outrageous behaviour.
I mean, that's why, like we said, I want to highlight the Cornwall Wildlife Trust, the way that they've acted. I think that is so much better. It's talking with farmers, giving them a choice, not victimising them, because farmers themselves are victims of bovine TB. It's devastating for them. And so I think this has caused a lot of issue with the cull and why people are so... think it's like animal activists and farmers, and it's a war. And it shouldn't be like that.
And that kind of behaviour only deepens the divide between opposing sides. And really, it only serves to further polarise the issue. That sort of behaviour is not saving badgers. And I think they should be ashamed of themselves. That's not the way to behave. To another human being, you can't do that. And so... that's, some very strong opposition, and, opposition is justified to it, but that is not the way to behave. However, there have been some very worrying recent governmental developments on this. So in early April to March of 2020, the government stated that they were going to be moving away from culling and investing more in vaccination programs. And so this is from a publicly available report. So I'm not doing what the Stop the Cull people are doing and naming and shaming, but this is a public report where the government, DEFRA, came out and said, we are accelerating other elements of our strategy, including vaccination and improved testing, so we can eradicate this insidious disease and start to phase out badger culling in England. So that sounds great. And it seems like the government is therefore following the evidence that we've kind of outlined earlier. But in September 2020, there was something of a U-turn on this, with the government expanding its badger cull policy to 12 new areas.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think, what's been described as a massive betrayal of public trust. They said they were starting to listen to the science. They realised that culling wasn't the way forwards. And they said, yeah, we're going to... I mean, I can see why they said they would do it slowly, because it takes a long time to convince farmers that culling, which is what they've been told for decades is the solution, is no longer going to work. But phasing out culling means possibly investing in more vaccination projects, not issuing another 12 cull licenses, and some of which is in areas that have never had culling before.
And that's an issue because this new culling licence, the goal will kill at least 70% of all English badgers, around 65,000, which would be the largest destruction of a protected species in, living memory, I suppose. And what's really interesting is that the target zones that they've chosen. So Derbyshire, Oxfordshire, Warwickshire, Shropshire, Leicestershire and Lincolnshire are the target zones. And yet Lincolnshire is considered a low-risk bovine TB area. And Derbyshire already has the biggest badger vaccination project in the country. So it doesn't seem like there has been that much actual planning to have gone into this. Or at the very least, the planning is obscure and, I can't make head or tail of it.
It makes no sense. All the scientists, even people who are sort of on the fence about this issue, they're so confused about why the licenses were issued and why in these locations. Like there's someone who's been working on the Derbyshire vaccination project. It's been in place for 7 years at this point, and there were some leaks about the cull sites where they were going to happen. And this woman was desperate. She realised that some of the badgers that they'd vaccinated, so I think 1,000 badgers they vaccinated to date, the zone extended far enough that the ones that they vaccinated could then be culled.
Oh my god.
Like, that's the overlap of they've just spent 7 years vaccinating them and they're possibly going to be shot.
Christ. And, this new U-turn has prompted a lot of controversy. So, as, very senior people who work in badger conservation have come out quite strongly against it, including the CEO of the Badger Trust, who said that, in his, expert opinion, it could result in population collapse with badgers pushed to the brink of local extinction. And they then go on to even further say this is no longer a badger control policy, it's a badger eradication exercise, which seems strange when, as we've just laid out, badger eradication is not needed to control bovine TB, and the government know this because they're funding the majority of the research going into this. So,
yeah.
And the chair of the Badger Trust very, pertinently points out that the government could kill every badger in England, but bovine TB will remain in cattle, as over 90% of infections are passed from cow to cow. So, there's a lot there to unpack. We hope it's made you think. It's a really polarising topic. It's polarised me and Emma, which is strange. We usually agree on everything. But yeah, I think this is a good time to kind of ask what you guys think. Do you have any experience in the countryside, perhaps, with where the cull is taking place? What are your experience with local badgers? Me and Emma love our badgers. And what do you think? What do you think about the cull? What do you think about, TVR, vaccinating badgers, vaccinating cattle? Do you agree with one of them? Should it be all three? We'd love to hear what you guys think about this.
Yeah, no, we definitely would. So I guess maybe just to sum up, what would you like to see, Robi? What's kind of your ideal solution to this?
My ideal solution would be nationwide, extremely rapid vaccination of all cows. My solution doesn't... Badgers are irrelevant to my solution. They're kind of, They're there. Badgers are not the problem to me. Based on the evidence that it's not badger to cattle, but cattle to cattle transmission that's the problem, well, we need to solve that problem, not the other problem. So my ideal solution, mass vaccination of every single cow in the UK. You could do it at birth. When they get born, they get a whole host of antibacterial jabs. Add the BT vaccine to that as well. BT? I keep saying BT. It's because of the bovine TB. It's BT. That's my solution. What's yours?
Key to me would be supporting farmers through this, making sure they're key to this topic. I would say cutting down the scale of cattle that we have in the UK is a solution for me. So we don't need as many cattle as we do currently. That's a personal opinion, but also one that's been supported by the CEO of the Badger Trust, who said that moving towards a more plant-based economy could help with that. And I think I agree with you, Robi. Mass vaccination of cattle, bring in the test that is starting to show that it's being effective, but in areas I think still where there's controversy, there's a lot going on, I think badgers need to be vaccinated. Okay. So I don't think there's any room for there should be no culling at all, but possibly some areas that we need to vaccinate badgers where the cull can't be, like where it's still phasing out the cull and they need a solution. So vaccinating badgers empowers the farmers and makes them feel like they have a solution there.
And I guess the last thing to end on is that wildlife welfare activists, like people like Stop the Cull, get a lot of kind of media attention from this, as does the government, as do scientists with letters after their name coming out with all the stats. But I think if any solution is going to be successful, as you said just now, entirely rightly, farmers kind of have to be at the heart of it. There needs to be a much stronger interaction between conservationists and farmers, and it needs to be farmers kind of leading the way with this, and they need to be given enough funding so they can do that. They need to be given enough provision by the state to accurately kind of log all their cattle jabs, and they're kind of, we think conservationists and scientists are on the front line of this issue. They're kind of not. I think it is the farmers. And so if we're going to make any strides, no matter what solution you think, I'm sure we can all agree that the farmers are the ones who actually need to be given control of this policy.
And I think that's when it will change, when it's farmers leading farmers and they see vaccination as a way forward and are no longer using badgers are no longer the blame. I think that's when it will take off. You need farmers to initiate that, I think.
So we hope you've enjoyed this podcast. We're going to wrap it up here. Sorry if we've left you, internally conflicted about the Badger Cull, but we thought it was given there's so many recent, new changes to policy, we thought it was good to talk about it. If you want to learn about it more, there's a fantastic Wild Live episode on, is it YouTube?
Yeah, it's live on YouTube now. It's really good. Called
The Badger Cull. Dun, dun, dun. And it's a conversation with Craig Bennett, Chris Packham, Joe Smith, Rosie Woodroffe, Dominic Dreyer and Cheryl Marriott, who are all very kind of involved in this issue. And we thought it was wonderful. They have this really in-depth, non-biased dissemination of the evidence, and they talk about the conclusions afterwards. So, yeah. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Biome Project. Do check us out, like and subscribe on YouTube. Make sure to leave a comment on your opinion. We'd love to hear from you. We're also on Instagram under Biome by Grizzly. And if you'd like to check out me and Emma, we have loads of badger footage, which we post all the time from our badgers. So if you'd like to see some badger footage of what they get up to, especially as spring comes along, they're going to have babies coming out and we're going to document that. You can find us at Emma Hodgson Wildlife on Instagram and Robi Watkinson Wildlife on Instagram. So bye, and we will see you next time.
Bye.